Tattersdill, who's a senior lecturer in popular literature at Birmingham and working on a project called Narrativizing Dinosaurs, and will be taking us beyond Brontosaurus.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is considerably beyond Brontosaurus. This is, of course, as I'm sure we all know, this is Sue in the Field Museum. Recently, this is as of last month, re-released to the public. And sitting, for me at least, and for a lot of people I think, although perhaps not the majority of the people in this room, firmly in the uncanny valley, because there's an instinctive level at this point in which we know that this is not what a Tyrannosaurus looks like. It looks like this. This is what Sue looked like before the change, illustrated here in a reconstruction that accompanies a restoration that accompanies Sue in the gallery. I think this is by John Gertsch. The new Sue is different from this in quite a lot of ways, but the most immediately obvious one is that deepened gastral basket. There's a line from one of the scientists there. People like to make T-Rex skinny like a greyhound, but they're actually very barrel-chested. That's Peter Makovicki. And actually, I have a sighthound, and a paleontologist visited me last weekend and said, "Oh, look, it's like a dog has been badly reconstructed." And I was like, "Thanks. I think she's quite beautiful." Anyway, back to this. Seeing a heavier Sue, let's say heavier, was not a surprise to at least two overlapping groups of people. The first is artists who have been making funny T-Rex pictures on the internet since basically the second it came online. And the second is paleo artists who have long held, and I just kind of mentioned this, that reconstructions of extinct life pay insufficient attention to soft tissue. So here's a swan reconstructed on those same greyhoundy principles by C.M. Kozman. I chose the one artist from this book who is not in the room right now to kind of illustrate my point. Dinosaurs changed, and here's the distinction modeled again by the Field Museum on their blog, before and after. It's kind of like the opposite of one of those weight loss ads. The dinosaurs changed over geological time via processes of evolution, but as we all know here, they also change over historical time and even over personal time as the information that we have about them and the impressions that we create of them in our minds kind of shifts. And thus it is that your age, among many other things, will determine the affection you feel for Zallinger's Peabody mural here, or for these lean, again, Jurassic World T-Rexes. The one on the right, which is from the poster from Fallen Kingdom, again, so greyhoundy, skin stretched so tightly over the body. This thing actually clears up a plot point because this thing is so hungry that it's hunting during a kind of cataclysmic volcanic eruption, which some people accused of being slightly unrealistic. And look, it needs a meal. For many, and I apologize again for mentioning the war here, this Tyrannosaur from an unnamed Hollywood feature film of 1993 has a kind of indelibility to it. You can teach people better, you show them the correct image, and for many, if not most, this will still be the reflexive image that people reach for when you say T-Rex to them, if they're the right age, if that's their context, if that's their background. There are lots of reasons for this, of course, as we all know here. Some are to do with science, and some, as we discussed yesterday, especially with regard to Elsa's brilliant paper, are to do with language, they're to do with narrative, they're to do with performance. Yes. Enter literary criticism. So this is me. As Chris said, I'm a literary critic. I'm particularly interested in science fiction and in the relationship between science fiction and reality, or between literature and science, if you like. And that's what I study, and that's what I think about a lot. And it's thinking about this kind of problem that I've outlined, this fact that for me as a non-expert, when I look at new Sue, my stomach says that's not a T-Rex, and my head feels a need to accept that this is a T-Rex and kind of correct for that, and that there's this dynamic going on within me in that moment. And it's trying to kind of articulate that and think about how that works that has led me to the idea that I'm going to kind of tentatively present as underpinning everything that follows. Most who reach adulthood in Western culture experience the death of dinosaurs at least twice. And there's lots of unpacking. I'm about to unpack this in great depth, so don't panic. But the word I want to really focus you on is experience, right? This is not about the actual KPG extinction event. This is about how we interact with the interactions, plural, that we have, the impressions of that event that we create for ourselves. So just bear with me for a minute while I kind of I kind of get through this. The two extinctions at least. The first is when, as a child, you slowly come to terms with the idea that when you go through your flashcards, monkey, zebra, triceratops, cat, that one of these things is not like the others, right? That there's a category difference here. And this isn't. This is something that dawns on you perhaps as well as you start going to museums. And you start to realize that when you see dinosaurs, when you go to see the dinosaurs, that's different from going to see the animals, and that they're presented differently. It's a difference of form, and I think it's like Father Christmas. It's not like you read the one asteroid book and suddenly have this dramatic revelation that non-avian dinosaurs are not amongst us anymore. It's a gradual coming to a realization. They're not here. I can't ever see one in the way that I'm going to see a tiger, for example. That's the first extinction. The second extinction, I'm going to pop this image up behind me and explain it in a moment. The second extinction occurs later in life when, encountering an up-to-date restoration, the same person comes to terms with the idea that the dinosaurs they recognize from their childhood have been rendered obsolete by new scientific innovations or discoveries. The realization that many species carried feathers, for instance, effectively invalidates almost every restoration made prior to the mid-1990s. Plenty made sense. But those restorations don't simply vanish from the minds of those for whom they were, at a formative moment, indexical examples of what constitutes a dinosaur. Rather, they are begrudgingly shifted into becoming tokens, no less indexical, of a fantasy past now lost, the dwindling of one's childhood, the vanishing into fallacy of the characters which accompanied it. This, I think, is experienced as a personal loss, even as a betrayal, since it involves realizing that something one learned in good faith had its status as fact removed from it when our attention was elsewhere. In this way, whilst the general concept of dinosaurs persists and is reinforced by scientific progress, I'll come back to that idea in a moment, particular visions of them take their place alongside the geocentric model, the luminiferous ether, and the four humors as kind of time-stamped ambassadors of science's missteps. They still exist, but as the objects of romance, fantasy, and nostalgia, rather than as the objects of science, empiricism, and reality. These two extinctions, I think, occur in the sense of occurring to someone. The OED says, of an idea to present itself in thought or come to mind. They are realizations rather than historical events, or we might better say realizations as well as historical events, since they remain profoundly historical in nature, thanks to their relationship with the actual KPG extinction, from which both are distinct. The second extinction is the incorporation of personal history into the unfolding geological history on which the first depends, but it also has the effect of making visible the fact that the first extinction, which felt like an objective fact at the time, was actually a subjective and unreliable human impression all along. Perhaps for that reason, the second is the more traumatic extinction of the two. It's one thing to be told that something you admire is dead, quite another to find out that it never existed at all, that while something walked around Mesozoic Earth, it didn't look like Burrian's T-Rex, or Woodward's Iguanodon, or Waterhouse Hawkins' Megalosaurus. A man is not dead while his name is still spoken, Pratchett tells us. Now they've been removed from the pantheon of the ontologically real, the responsibility for our childhood dinosaurs' continued epistemological existence, which is the only kind, it turns out, that they ever really had, rests solely with us. And so that's the reading it out bit. Sorry about that. For some disclaimers for the keen. No, I don't think this is a universal principle. Yes, I think there probably are more than two extinctions, and I'm going to try in the rest of my time to kind of get to that and how we might deal with that. And yes, I think this is an idea which is conveniently very hard to prove or disprove in any particular case. I only have access really to the kind of inner workings of one mind, and then only impartially. I like it, though, this idea of the second extinction. The reason I like it is because of the interface that it gives us with the progress narrative that Chris opened by discussing yesterday. So there's the evolutionary progress narrative, which Elsa cautioned us against and others yesterday. There's the progress of our understanding of the natural world, an idea of science's continual improvement, which kind of mirrors that and is perhaps equally subject to question in some regard. And then the third thing, our personal relationships with both of these models of progress and how they work. And I think that the virtue of the second extinction is that it allows us to talk about all three of these things at once. To think about to think about deep time and human time and our own personal experiences of these things kind of in the same breath. This is very easy to do. It's very easy to talk about with images, right? You can talk about thumb spikes on noses. You talk about snorkeling sauropods. You can talk about the lack of an appropriate level of feathering, and I have already kind of mentioned that. And in the longer version of this piece, I kind of attempt a close reading of several images that kind of tries to situate this and back it up a bit, but because one of those images is by Mark and he's in the room and I'm a Victorianist by training and can't really deal with the idea of a living author being in my presence while I'm talking about their work, and because I'm a literary critic and not an art historian, I'm actually more comfortable talking about words. And one of the things that interested me is how do these things, which are so kind of obvious and even emotionally affecting when an image presents itself, how do these things come across in language? How do these things come across in the narratives that we read, popular and scientific, about dinosaurs? And the most immediately obvious way of thinking about this is with names. So our illustration here is a nice Brontosaurus. It's Stanek Buren's Brontosaurus, painted probably in the late 1940s. The late 1940s, roughly the middle of the century plus period during which this creature didn't exist, right? No Brontosaurus. It may still not exist. Shop et al., which putatively restores this thing to life. I've heard, that some people think that study needs replicating before we actually sign the dotted line, as it were. So it may still not exist. Of course, it existed all along. As Apatosaurus, those bones were still there in the museum. Nothing changed about them. We switched the skull a couple of times, but that's irrelevant. Don't think about that too much. The animal was there. And of course, it also doesn't exist at all. It hasn't existed for 145 million years. What are you talking about? This is a non-existent animal. That's why we're interested in it. That's why it's here. So it may not exist. Of course, it existed all along. Of course, it doesn't exist. This complex metaphysical situation arises, as I'm sure most of us know, because of the ICZN rule, which requires that should the same animal be named twice, in this instance both times by our good friend O.C. Marsh, the earlier name takes precedence. There are sound reasons for this rule, but one effect of them is that our names for these animals adequate our initial misapprehensions about them. So adequate there, that's an English lit word that I'm taking from I.A. Richards, adequate, that become so habituated to a part of language that we don't think about its status as a part of language at all. An adequated metaphor would be something like he exploded with rage. You forget even that there is the visual of an explosion in that sentence. You don't notice it anymore. It's just become part of how we talk. It's adequated. And dinosaur names, because of the ICZN rules, adequate mistakes in the same way. So that's why we still call oviraptors egg thieves, even though they do not in fact steal eggs. And it's why we call dinosaurs terrible lizards, and although in fact we now know that they were neither terrible nor lizards. And in fact that terrible is a bit of a dodgy translation of dinos, which actually my classicist colleagues tell me means something more like awesome or fearfully great, wonderful. So not terrible, not lizards. And sauropods, as Michael P. Taylor has pointed out, don't have particularly lizard-like feet. But poor Brontosaurus has had much bigger problems even than this, even than kind of the direction of the name. Almost every word that is used to discuss it, I think, is freighted with the collision between its prehistorical reality and its cultural status as one of the most iconic non-dinosaurs of the 20th century. Here are a few examples of the Brontosaurus in 20th century popular culture. So we've got Littlefoot in Land Before Time, No One Cry. We've got Baby in the middle there. Gertie, one of the first animated films in the top right-hand corner. Continuing around clockwise in the bottom right, we have Bringing Up Baby, which is kind of screwball comedy from the 1930s. Bottom left, Beyond the Great South Wall. I stuck that in for you, Richard. Congratulations. And right in the bottom is Arlo from Pixar's 2015, The Good Dinosaur. And before you say, but Arlo is an Apatosaurus, I invite you to consider that they can call him that if they like, but this is a Brontosaurus. And yes, there is a difference. Sinclair, by the way, has been dutifully calling Dino an Apatosaurus since the late 1960s. Which is slim comfort, given that the company was founded in 1904, 1 year after Brontosaurus was invalidated by Riggs, and didn't start using dino and the word Brontosaurus until 1930. What does it mean to have so many cultural images of a non-existent animal? Or, to put it differently, is there a difference between images like these and those of a T-Rex from the same period, which may likely be found to be as wanting in their relationship to the actual Mesozoic as the images that we see here. To ask these questions, I think, is to deal head-on with the second extinction. So to proceed at last to a textual example, here's Brian Switek, whose 2013 My Beloved Brontosaurus is simultaneously a popular account of recent dinosaur science and a love letter to the invalidated dinosaurs of the past. And I think it's precisely because it deliberately sits on both of these stools that this book is one of the most overt contemplations of the second extinction that I've been able to find. It comes, of course, just 2 years before Brontosaurus was putatively restored by Schopp and colleagues. So standing before Peabody's Brontosaurus, Switek feels the Peabody is the type specimen. It's the one that Marsh used to generate that name. Switek feels the tension between his updated adult knowledge and his childhood sense of wonder. I knew the dinosaur's proper name full well. He knows the science, but I couldn't deny the title Marsh himself had once bestowed on these bones. This was the original Brontosaurus. And he does this thing throughout the book, it's quite remarkable, where he puts Brontosaurus in italic to indicate a scientific name, in inverted commas to indicate that he knows that it's not really a scientific name anymore because it's not allowed. But then the book is called My Beloved Brontosaurus, and the inverted commas aren't in that, and the title of the book is at the top of every even-numbered page, which kind of undermines the gesture, right? So this baggage is like literally running through, like a seam running through your book as you're holding it in hand. Describing the animal as one of the instigators of his own interest in prehistoric life, Switek articulates the sense of regret that he feels as its conceptual demise. The long-necked giant was my introduction to how magnificent dinosaurs were, but she evaporated into the scientific ether just as soon as I met her. The scientific ether is an apt metaphor here, since the idea of the luminiferous ether was invalidated in 1905 in the wake of the Michelson-Morley experiment and with the advent of Einstein's special relativity. And fittingly, this happens, as I've just mentioned, at exactly the moment that Brontosaurus was itself evaporated by Riggs. The timing matters for another reason. It would be easy to suppose from this passage, just as soon as I met her, right, that Brontosaurus was an extant taxa during Switek's childhood. But in fact, the question of its non-existence had been settled to the satisfaction of specialists well over a half-century earlier. As with the ether, which has continued to turn up in popular and even scientific culture long after being denuded of its scientific status, it seems that the facticity of Brontosaurus has long survived the official removal of its name from the honor rolls. Even in the moment of Switek's initial childhood encounter with it, the animal is wrong and known to be so. And there are lots of different explanations of this. Some are scientific, some are to do with the culture of science, and Paul's book kind of outlines that this is partly because Osborne won't accept Riggs's kind of changes, won't use his names. But this is also an interesting moment of elision here, I think, with Switek's kind of childhood self and his adult self who knows better, kind of looking at this object and trying to understand it, because he does know this, right? He's not writing in ignorance of anything I've just said. He outlines the exact history that I've given you here on the evaporation of the Brontosaurus just a few pages later. So his instinct to draw a veil over it in this particular sentence becomes as suggestive as his instinct, which is equally unjustified by the science, to assign female pronouns to the specimen. In both cases, a nostalgic haziness bestows character on young Switek in the case of the timing and the old dinosaur in the case of the pronouns. The book can then position Switek as both a sober adult guide to the latest fossil science and a wide-eyed child absorbing carefully the lessons of the inaccurate thunder lizard. This is my last quotation. She is a familiar milestone that we can use to measure just how much science has changed dinosaurs. With Brontosaurus as our traveling companion, let's catch up with some old friends and see what secrets they've begun to teach us about evolution, extinction, and survival. And what I want you to notice about this passage in particular is how many things the Brontosaurus gets to be in these two sentences, right? A milestone, a yardstick, a guide, a traveling companion, a friend, a teacher, all of these things kind of in the same gesture. And apart from the barely metaphorical milestone, right, which proposes to use Brontosaurus in a way exactly as advertised as a reference point to the past, the thing to notice here is the recasting of the outdated Brontosaurus as a traveling companion, rather like the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, and Joe, we were discussing this a little bit yesterday, they kind of, they're wrong, but it's okay because they're a guide to the past and it's about scientific process and we're actually learning a lot, so it's still good and we should build a bridge to them. Transformed then from a subject into a teacher of that subject, right? That shift of identity gets to retain an existence which is expressly allied to scientific value. Companions and milestones, though, are fundamentally different things. In getting to be at once both signpost and wayfarer, this particular dinosaur retains its indivisible membership of both science and the humanities. So kind of the place I want to leave it in, and with the idea of the second extinction still kind of floating in the air, is to say that one of the things you can do if you think about these things together is you can use it to muddy the waters, and you can use it to say that actually when these things were in the domain of science, they were never completely scientific. And now that they've left the domain of science, they nevertheless bring some science with them, and they don't completely become cultural objects. There's always that exchange, there's always that middle ground, there's always that crossover, and it very often happens inside individual people, inside their heads, but possibly their hearts as well. And I will stop there.